August 15, 1945. The day Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled across radio waves throughout Japan, announcing surrender. But in a dusty corner of Texas, at a hastily constructed facility outside Fort Stockton, a different kind of history was about to unfold. When the transport truck rolled through the gates carrying 32 Japanese women prisoners, the American guards stood in stunned silence. This was unprecedented. The war in the Pacific had produced thousands of male prisoners, but never before had a group of Japanese women been captured and brought to American soil. Lieutenant Vera Caldwell, a stern but fair officer from Vermont, watched as the women descended from the truck. They moved with military precision, despite their exhaustion, their dark eyes reflecting a mixture of shame and defiance. Most wore remnants of auxiliary uniforms, though some had been given civilian clothes during their transport from the Philippines. They ranged in age from 19 to 38, and each carried herself with the rigid dignity of someone who had been taught that capture was the ultimate dishonor. Among them was 23-year-old Yoshiko Kimura, a former communications specialist from Osaka. She had served with the Imperial Japanese Army in Manila, translating intercepted American radio transmissions until the final chaotic days of the Philippine campaign. Now, standing in the scorching Texas heat, she clutched a small silk pouch containing the only photograph she had of her family. Her younger brother's face smiled up at her from the worn image, frozen in time before he had shipped out to some unknown Pacific island. The women formed into neat rows without being asked, their training evident in every movement. They stood at attention while Lieutenant Caldwell read the camp rules in English, which was then translated by a Nisei interpreter who had volunteered for this difficult duty. The translator, a young woman whose own family had been interned in California camps, spoke with visible discomfort as she conveyed the terms of their captivity to people who had until recently considered her kind to be traitors. Yoshiko listened to the rules with growing confusion. They would be housed in barracks with beds and mattresses. They would receive 3 meals daily. They would have access to medical care and basic necessities. This contradicted everything she had been told about American brutality toward prisoners. She had expected torture, starvation, perhaps execution. Instead, she was being told about work assignments, recreation time, and the possibility of receiving mail. The other women showed similar bewilderment on their faces. Sumiko Ono, a nurse who had tended wounded soldiers until the very end, kept glancing at the well-maintained buildings and the guards who carried weapons but showed no signs of immediate violence. Haruko Nishimura, who had worked in administrative roles, stood perfectly still, but her eyes darted everywhere, cataloging details that didn't match the propaganda she had absorbed for years. As the sun began to set over the Texas landscape, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the women were led to their barracks. Tomorrow would bring their first full day in American captivity, and none of them could have imagined what that would mean. The first 2 weeks at Fort Stockton passed in rigid silence. The Japanese women moved through their daily routines like ghosts, speaking only to each other in hushed Japanese during the brief moments they were allowed to gather. They woke at dawn, made their beds with military precision, ate their meals without comment, and performed their assigned duties with mechanical efficiency. But they refused to meet the eyes of their captors or acknowledge any kindness offered to them. Lieutenant Vera Caldwell found herself increasingly frustrated by the impenetrable wall the women had erected around themselves. She had overseen male German and Italian prisoners who, after initial hostility, had gradually become more cooperative and even friendly. But these Japanese women seemed determined to remain completely isolated, as if interaction with Americans would contaminate them somehow. She noticed how they ate their meals quickly, heads down, never pausing to enjoy the food or show any reaction to what they were given. Private Eugene Mitchell, a gangly 20-year-old from rural Georgia, struggled most with the women's silence. He had never met anyone from Japan before and had grown up with stories of Japanese savagery from the newspapers and radio broadcasts. But watching these women go about their days with such quiet dignity, he found his preconceptions beginning to crack. One morning he noticed Yoshiko shivering slightly in the cool dawn air as the women lined up for roll call. Without thinking, he approached her with an extra blanket he had retrieved from storage. Yoshiko stared at the offered blanket as if it were a weapon. Her training had taught her that Americans would use any pretense to humiliate or harm prisoners. She expected a trap, some cruel joke that would end in punishment or mockery, but Private Mitchell simply held it out, his young face showing nothing but genuine concern. After a long moment, she took the blanket with the slightest bow of her head, then immediately turned away. Mitchell walked back to his post, confused, but somehow pleased that she had accepted it. The incident did not go unnoticed by the other women. That evening, in the privacy of their barracks, they discussed it in rapid Japanese. Sumiko argued that accepting anything from the Americans showed weakness, but Haruko pointed out that the emperor himself had surrendered, leaving them in an impossible position. What did honor mean now? What were they resisting, and why? Yoshiko said nothing during these debates. She folded the blanket carefully and placed it at the foot of her bunk. That night she used it to ward off the chill, and she found herself thinking about the young soldier's face. He had looked almost embarrassed to offer her kindness, as if he too was uncertain about what the rules should be between former enemies. Corporal Vincent Shaw, who supervised the mess hall, noticed similar small breaches in the wall of silence. When Kyoko Sato accidentally dropped a tray of tin cups, she had frozen in terror, clearly expecting punishment. Shaw had simply knelt down to help her pick them up. Kyoko had looked at him with such surprise that Shaw found himself wondering what kind of treatment she had expected. The morning of September 1st brought an unexpected change to the daily routine. Lieutenant Caldwell announced that all 32 women would be reassigned to various duties throughout the camp, with the majority going to work in the mess hall under the supervision of Corporal Vincent Shaw and the head cook, Sergeant Otto Jensen. The decision had been made partly for practical reasons, as the camp was understaffed, but also because Caldwell believed that meaningful work might help ease the women's obvious distress and isolation. Yoshiko found herself part of the first group of 12 women assigned to kitchen duties. They arrived at the mess hall at 5:30 in the morning to help prepare breakfast for the camp's 200 personnel. Sergeant Jensen, a broad-shouldered man of Norwegian descent from Minnesota, surveyed his new workers with a mixture of curiosity and concern. He had cooked for prisoners before, but never for women, and never for Japanese prisoners, who looked at him as if he might poison them at any moment. The mess hall itself was a revelation to the women. They walked through the storage areas and saw shelves stocked with canned goods, sacks of flour and sugar, and crates of fresh vegetables that had been delivered from nearby farms. Yoshiko stopped in front of a shelf lined with canned peaches, her eyes widening at the sheer quantity. In Japan, such abundance had become a distant memory years before the war ended. Rationing had reduced most civilians to meager bowls of rice mixed with whatever could be foraged or grown in small gardens. Sergeant Jensen noticed her staring at the canned peaches. He pulled one down and held it up to the light, showing her the golden fruit suspended in syrup through the clear glass. "Peaches?" he said slowly. "From Georgia and Texas. We got plenty." He gestured at the shelves. Yoshiko looked away quickly, but not before he saw the confusion in her eyes. She had been told that America was starving, that the war had brought the enemy to its knees. Yet here was more food in one storage room than she had seen in years. The women were assigned various tasks. Some peeled potatoes, others washed dishes, and a few were taught to operate the large ovens. Haruko, who had once worked in her family's restaurant in Kyoto, found herself drawn to the actual cooking despite her determination to remain detached. Sergeant Jensen demonstrated how to crack eggs efficiently, and she watched with professional interest even as she maintained her silence. Breakfast preparation revealed more contradictions. The American soldiers were served generous portions of scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter, and fresh coffee. There were no signs of the desperate scarcity that Japanese propaganda had promised was crippling the American war effort. Even more shocking was when Sergeant Jensen prepared plates for the Japanese women workers, giving them the same food in the same quantities as the American personnel. Yoshiko stared at her breakfast plate, unable to reconcile what she was seeing with what she had believed. The bacon's rich smell made her stomach clench with hunger she had been ignoring, but accepting this food felt like a betrayal. Around them, the other women hesitated, looking to each other for guidance that none of them could provide. Finally, hunger won over ideology. They ate slowly, almost reverently, tasting butter and eggs and meat that had become luxuries beyond imagination in their homeland. 3 weeks into their kitchen assignment, the women had settled into a cautious routine. They performed their duties efficiently, had learned basic English kitchen terms, and no longer flinched when American personnel spoke to them. But they still maintained their emotional distance, treating each day as a task to be completed rather than a life to be lived. That changed on September 23rd when Sergeant Otto Jensen decided to make peach cobbler for Sunday dinner. The women watched with curiosity as Jensen pulled out the large mixing bowls and began assembling ingredients they had never seen combined before. Flour, sugar, butter, cinnamon, and those canned peaches that had fascinated Yoshiko on her first day. He worked with the easy confidence of someone who had made this dessert hundreds of times, explaining each step, even though he knew most of the women couldn't fully understand his English. Haruko moved closer, her professional interest in cooking overcoming her reserve as she observed his technique. Jensen opened 6 large cans of peaches, and the sweet syrup smell filled the kitchen. He showed them how to arrange the fruit in deep baking pans, then prepared the cobbler topping, a mixture of flour, sugar, butter, and milk that he dropped in spoonfuls over the peaches. The women watched in fascination as he slid the pans into the large ovens. "Wait till you see it golden brown," he said with obvious pride. "Best thing you'll ever taste." 45 minutes later, when Jensen pulled the cobblers from the ovens, the entire mess hall filled with an aroma unlike anything the Japanese women had experienced. The topping had turned a perfect golden brown, and the peach filling bubbled around the edges, creating a caramelized crust. Jensen cut generous portions and placed them on plates, then did something unexpected. He served the women first, before the American personnel, giving each of them a large square of the still warm dessert, topped with a dollop of fresh cream. Yoshiko stared at her plate. The golden brown topping glistened in the overhead lights, and steam rose from the hot peach filling beneath. The smell was intoxicating, sweet and rich, and completely foreign. Around her, the other women held their spoons uncertainly. This wasn't just food for sustenance. This was something created purely for pleasure, for enjoyment. It seemed almost obscene in its abundance and sweetness. Sumiko was the first to taste it. She brought a small spoonful to her lips, and her eyes widened immediately. The warm peaches, the buttery topping, the cold cream mixing with the hot dessert created a combination of flavors and textures that seemed impossible. She took another bite, then another, unable to stop herself. The other women followed, and soon the kitchen filled with the quiet sounds of spoons scraping plates as they savored every last trace of cobbler and cream. Yoshiko finished her portion and sat motionless, the empty plate before her. For the first time since her capture, tears ran down her face. Private Mitchell, watching from nearby, understood that something profound had just shifted in these women's understanding of their captors. The days following the peach cobbler incident brought subtle but unmistakable changes to the atmosphere in the mess hall. The Japanese women arrived for their shifts with something that resembled anticipation rather than resignation. They began asking hesitant questions about the food they were preparing, pointing at ingredients and waiting for someone to provide the English words. Sergeant Jensen found himself becoming an unlikely language teacher, holding up items and pronouncing their names slowly while the women repeated after him with careful concentration. Yoshiko discovered she had retained more English from her school days than she had realized. Words that had seemed useless during the war now became tools for connection and understanding. She began serving as an informal translator between Jensen and the other women, bridging the gap with her growing vocabulary. The sergeant seemed genuinely pleased by her efforts, never showing impatience when she struggled to find the right words or had to resort to gestures to convey meaning. One morning, as the women were cleaning up after breakfast, Haruko approached Corporal Shaw with obvious nervousness. She carried a small notebook where she had been sketching pictures of various dishes she had helped prepare. Through a combination of broken English and gestures, she asked if she could learn to make more American foods. Shaw, surprised by the request, immediately brought her to Jensen. The cook's face lit up with enthusiasm at the prospect of having a genuinely interested student. That afternoon, Jensen gave Haruko her first real cooking lesson. He showed her how to make biscuits from scratch, explaining the importance of keeping the butter cold and not overworking the dough. Haruko's hands, trained in the delicate preparation of Japanese cuisine, adapted quickly to these new techniques. The other women gathered to watch, and soon, Jensen found himself teaching an entire class rather than a single student. He didn't mind. In fact, he seemed to relish the opportunity to share his craft with such attentive pupils. Private Mitchell noticed how the women's posture had changed. They no longer moved through the camp with their eyes cast down in shame. Instead, they walked with purpose, sometimes even exchanging small smiles with the American personnel they encountered. One evening, he saw Yoshiko sitting outside the barracks, practicing English words from a list that Corporal Shaw had written out for her. When she noticed him watching, she didn't turn away as she would have done weeks earlier. Instead, she held up the paper and asked him to help her with pronunciation. Mitchell sat down beside her, and for an hour they worked through the list together. He learned that her name meant good child in Japanese, and she learned that his name came from a Greek word meaning well-born. They laughed together at the strangeness of their names' meanings, and in that moment of shared humor, the distance between captor and captive seemed to dissolve. By the time Mitchell returned to his duties, he no longer saw Yoshiko as a prisoner or even as Japanese. He saw her simply as a young woman far from home, trying to make sense of circumstances neither of them had chosen. October brought cooler weather to Texas and news that would shatter the fragile peace the women had begun to find. Lieutenant Caldwell received a packet of letters that had been routed through the International Red Cross, correspondence that had taken months to reach the United States from Japan. She called the women together in the recreation hall, and the atmosphere immediately tensed. For weeks, they had existed in a strange limbo, disconnected from the reality of what had happened to their homeland. Now that barrier was about to fall. Caldwell distributed the letters to those whose names appeared on the envelopes. Only 14 of the 32 women received anything. The others sat in silence, understanding that no letter likely meant no family left to write. Yoshiko's hands trembled as she accepted the thin envelope with her name written in her mother's careful script. The paper felt impossibly light, as if it might dissolve at any moment and take with it the last connection to her previous life. She opened it slowly and began to read. Her mother's words were carefully chosen, constrained by censors and by the limits of what could be expressed on paper. But between the lines, Yoshiko read a story of devastation that made her stomach turn. Her father had died in an air raid on Osaka in March. Her younger brother had been killed at Okinawa. Their home was gone, reduced to ashes and rubble. Her mother was living with distant relatives in a rural village, surviving on rations that barely sustained life. The letter ended with a single question that would haunt Yoshiko for years to come. What kind of country did we serve? Around the room, similar scenes unfolded As other women absorbed news of atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of cities turned to wastelands, of families scattered or destroyed, Sumiko learned that her entire neighborhood in Tokyo had been firebombed. Kyoko discovered that her parents had died from radiation sickness after Nagasaki. Masako read that her husband, a naval officer, had been declared missing and presumed dead. The women who received no letters sat with their own terrible knowledge. Silence meant loss. It meant there was no one left to write, no one left to remember them or wait for their return. Teruko Ando, who had received nothing, stared at her empty hands and understood that she was now completely alone in the world. Everything and everyone she had known was simply gone, erased by fire and bombs and the relentless machinery of total war. That evening, the mess hall was silent except for the sounds of food being prepared and served. The women ate mechanically, tasting nothing. Even Sergeant Jensen's attempts at conversation met with no response. Private Mitchell watched Yoshiko sit motionless over her untouched dinner, her eyes red from crying. He wanted to offer comfort, but had no idea what words could possibly address the magnitude of what these women had just learned. The peach cobbler that had seemed to bridge the distance between them now sat uneaten on plates throughout the hall, suddenly irrelevant in the face of such devastating loss. The week following the letters from Japan was the darkest period the camp had experienced. The women moved through their duties like shadows, their brief emergence from isolation crushed under the weight of grief and guilt. Lieutenant Caldwell consulted with Dr. Florence Hartley about their deteriorating mental state. Several women had stopped eating entirely. Others lay in their bunks for hours, staring at nothing. The doctor worried about the possibility of suicide, a concern rooted in understanding of Japanese cultural attitudes toward honor and failure. It was Sergeant Jensen who proposed the unexpected solution. He approached Lieutenant Caldwell with a simple request. Let me teach them to cook, really cook, not just peel potatoes and wash dishes. Give them something to create instead of just survive. Caldwell was skeptical, but desperate enough to try anything that might pull the women back from the edge of despair they were approaching. Jensen began the next morning by asking Haruko if she would help him make peach cobbler from scratch. He spoke gently, as if addressing someone recovering from illness. At first, she simply shook her head and turned away. But Jensen persisted, setting out the ingredients and beginning the process himself. He worked slowly, deliberately, describing each step in his accented English. After 20 minutes, Haruko approached the work table. Her hands reached for the flour without a word. Within an hour, 8 women had gathered around Jensen's workspace. He guided them through the entire process, from opening the cans of peaches to mixing the perfect cobbler topping. He let them measure, mix, and taste. When Yoshiko accidentally added too much cinnamon, he simply laughed and showed her how to adjust the recipe to compensate. There was no judgment, no criticism, only the quiet absorption of creating something with their hands. The cobbler that emerged from the oven that afternoon was their work, not his. Jensen made them understand this through gestures and simple words. You made this. You, not me. When they served it to the American personnel at dinner, Corporal Shaw made a point of complimenting the Japanese cooks specifically. Best cobbler we've had in weeks, he announced loudly. These ladies have talent. Something shifted in the women's expressions. For the first time since the letters arrived, Yoshiko felt a flicker of something other than grief. Pride, perhaps, or purpose. The realization that even in the midst of overwhelming loss, she could still create something that brought others pleasure. It was a small thing, trivial even, but it felt like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in dark water. Jensen established a daily schedule. Each afternoon he would teach a different recipe to whoever wanted to learn. American pot roast, cornbread, apple pie, fried chicken. The women began to gather not because they were ordered to, but because these hours of focused creation provided refuge from the thoughts that tormented them during empty moments. Food became their language of healing, each recipe a conversation about life beyond grief, about the possibility that something could still be built from the ruins of everything they had lost. November brought official word that repatriation procedures would begin for all Japanese prisoners of war. Ships were being organized to transport thousands of prisoners back to Japan throughout the winter months. The women at Fort Stockton were scheduled for departure in mid-December, giving them roughly 5 weeks to prepare for their return to a homeland most of them no longer recognized. Lieutenant Caldwell posted the announcement on the barracks bulletin board, and the women gathered around it in silence, reading the details of their impending freedom with expressions that resembled dread more than relief. That evening, Yoshiko sat on her bunk holding her mother's letter, reading it for perhaps the 100th time. What kind of country did we serve? The question had been rhetorical when her mother wrote it, but now it demanded an answer. What was she returning to? A country devastated by atomic weapons, occupied by foreign troops, stripped of the empire it had built and the ideology that had justified everything. Her mother was alive, but living in poverty with distant relatives who likely resented another mouth to feed. Her home was ashes. Her father and brother were dead. Around her, the other women faced similar calculations. Sumiko had learned that Tokyo was a wasteland of rubble and makeshift shelters. Kyoko knew that Nagasaki, her home city, was still dealing with the mysterious sickness that followed the atomic bomb. Masako had no family left at all, only the uncertain prospect of returning to a village that might not even exist anymore. The women who had received no letters faced perhaps the worst uncertainty, returning to complete unknowns with no idea what or who might be waiting for them. Yet the alternative seemed impossible to even contemplate. How could they ask to remain in enemy captivity? How could they choose to stay in America when their country needed rebuilding? The shame of such a choice felt almost unbearable, a final betrayal that would mark them as traitors to everything they had once believed in. But as the days passed and December approached, conversations in the barracks began to change. The women started speaking openly about their fears and their growing attachment to the life they had built at Fort Stockton. Mrs. Geneva Blackwell, a church volunteer from the nearby town of Alpine, had been visiting the camp weekly since October. She had befriended several of the women, bringing them small gifts and practicing English conversation with them. One afternoon, she sat with Yoshiko in the recreation hall and asked her directly what she wanted to do. Not what honor demanded, not what duty required, but what she genuinely wanted for her own future. Yoshiko found herself unable to answer. For her entire life, she had been taught that personal desires were irrelevant compared to duty and service. But Mrs. Blackwell persisted gently. "You're 23 years old. You have skills, intelligence, and your whole life ahead of you. What do you want that life to look like?" The question cracked something open inside Yoshiko. She realized that for the first time in years, she had been happy during those afternoons learning to cook with Sergeant Jensen. She had felt valued when Corporal Shaw complimented her translation work. She had experienced friendship in her conversations with Private Mitchell. Here, in this prison camp in Texas, she had discovered a version of herself that had nothing to do with empire or ideology or duty. December 5th arrived with unexpected cold, a frost that turned the Texas landscape white and made the women huddle in their barracks, wrapped in blankets that had once been gifts from uncertain guards. Lieutenant Caldwell had called a final assembly to review repatriation procedures before the transport ships departed in 10 days. The 32 women gathered in the recreation hall, their faces reflecting weeks of internal struggle about what this moment would mean for their futures. Caldwell stood before them with her characteristic military bearing, but her expression had softened over the months. These women were no longer simply prisoners to be processed and shipped away. They had become individuals she knew by name, whose stories she had heard, whose transformation she had witnessed. She began explaining the logistics of their departure, the processing centers in California, the ships that would carry them across the Pacific to Yokohama, and the uncertain procedures that would follow in occupied Japan. Then Yoshiko stood up. Her hands were steady now, her English clear and confident. "Lieutenant Caldwell, may I speak?" Caldwell nodded, sensing something significant was about to happen. Yoshiko looked around at her fellow prisoners before continuing. "Some of us have been discussing our situation. We understand we are scheduled for repatriation, but we wish to know if there is any possibility, any legal way, for some of us to remain in the United States." The words fell like stones into still water. Several American personnel exchanged confused glances. Private Mitchell stared at Yoshiko with surprise, mixed with something that might have been hope. Even the other Japanese women showed varying reactions, some nodding in agreement, while others looked away in apparent shame. Caldwell was momentarily speechless. She had never encountered prisoners of war requesting to remain in captivity rather than accept freedom and return home. She asked for clarification, and what followed revealed the depth of transformation these women had undergone. Yoshiko explained that 7 of them had discussed this extensively. They had written to the Red Cross again, seeking updated information about conditions in Japan. The responses painted an even bleaker picture than the October letters. Food shortages were severe. Housing was nearly impossible to find. Women alone, without family connections or resources, faced prospects that ranged from dire to desperate. But more than fear of hardship, Yoshiko continued, they had found something at Fort Stockton they had never experienced in Japan. "Here we have learned what it means to be valued as individuals, not as servants of empire. Sergeant Jensen has taught us skills and treated us with respect. Mrs. Blackwell has shown us friendship without judgment. We have been given the opportunity to become better versions of ourselves." Sumiko stood next, followed by Haruko, Kyoko, and 3 others. They formed a small group within the larger assembly. Each woman offered her own testimony of transformation, of discovering that the enemy they had been taught to hate had instead offered them dignity and hope. Lieutenant Caldwell sat down slowly, understanding she was witnessing something unprecedented in the history of American prisoner of war operations, and that her response would shape these women's lives forever. 25 years after that December morning, when 7 Japanese women made the unprecedented choice to remain in America, Yoshiko Kimura stood in her Austin kitchen, teaching her daughter how to make peach cobbler. Her hands moved with practiced confidence, measuring flour and sugar with precision learned from a patient Norwegian cook in a prison camp. Her daughter Emma watched carefully, trying to memorize each step. Through the window, Yoshiko could see her husband Thomas tending the garden. The gangly private from Georgia, who had offered her a blanket decades ago, had proposed in 1948, 3 years after she chose to stay. Yoshiko had become a translator for the State Department, helping Japanese immigrants navigate building lives in America. Her fluency in both languages and unique perspective made her invaluable in bridging cultural gaps. She had helped hundreds of families find housing and employment, always remembering how Mrs. Geneva Blackwell had done the same for her when she first transitioned from prisoner to immigrant. Of the 7 women who chose to remain, all built meaningful lives. Haruko opened a restaurant in San Antonio serving both Japanese and American cuisine, becoming famous for fusion dishes that honored both traditions. Sumiko became a nurse at a veterans hospital, caring for American soldiers who had once been her captors. Kyoko married a local rancher and raised 4 children who grew up speaking both English and Japanese, embodying the possibility of reconciliation between cultures. But their decision had never been easy. They faced discrimination and suspicion, especially in early years when Pearl Harbor memories remained raw. Some communities refused to accept them. Some Americans never stopped seeing them as enemies. They carried the weight of knowing they had chosen personal survival over the duty to help rebuild Japan. That guilt never entirely disappeared, though it softened over time. The 25 women who chose repatriation had their own complicated journeys. Several wrote to Yoshiko over the years, describing challenges of rebuilding lives in occupied Japan, but also expressing purpose in contributing to their country's recovery. Some prospered in the new Japan. Others struggled with poverty for years. A few later immigrated to America themselves, reconnecting with their former fellow prisoners. Sergeant Otto Jensen had remained in touch until his death in 1967. He attended Yoshiko's wedding and taught cooking classes for Japanese immigrants, always maintaining that those months teaching Japanese women to make peach cobbler were among the most meaningful of his military career. As Emma slid the cobbler into the oven, she asked why peach cobbler was so important to their family. Yoshiko smiled and began telling her daughter about a prison camp in Texas, a Norwegian cook who treated enemy prisoners with dignity, and a dessert that taught her that even in the darkest moments, human kindness could create impossible possibilities. Every time they made peach cobbler, they honored not just a recipe, but a legacy of transformation, forgiveness, and the courageous choice to believe that former enemies could become family. The story had become a testament to America's capacity for redemption and to the power of simple kindness to overcome the deepest divisions of war and hatred.